He found me at 6:30 in the morning on day 29. I was in the Cabernet Sauvignon block doing the final pre-harvest assessment, checking cluster development, reading the color on the fruit, doing the specific work of the last days before a harvest that I had spent 28 days making possible. The morning was the particular cool of early October in the Paso Robles hills, the light coming in low from the east the way it comes in autumn when the season has finally admitted what it is. Sebastian was at the end of the vine row in his pajamas and his boots. The boots were his great-grandfather Edward's. Old working boots, brown leather, kept by Rosamond for 60 years, and claimed by Sebastian at age 6 with the complete authority of a child who has decided something belongs to him. They were too large for him still. He wore them anyway every morning to the vineyard, because the vineyard was where he was going and the boots were what you wore to the vineyard. He looked at me from the end of the row. He said, "You're leaving tomorrow." I said, "Day after tomorrow. Tomorrow is day 30. He said, "And then you go." I kept my hands on the vine I was assessing, feeling the weight of the cluster, checking the bloom on the skin of the fruit, the things you feel rather than see at this stage of development. I did not look up from the vine immediately because I needed a moment before I looked at Sebastian in his pajamas and his two large boots at 6:30 in the morning with that expression on his face. He said, "I know what the arrangement was. I'm asking if you have to go." 29 days earlier, I had driven up the access road to the Ashworth Estate with my assessment kit, my notebooks, my 13-year-old son Owen in the passenger seat, and no intention of being anyone's husband for 30 days or any other duration. I had a consulting contract and a specific professional task and a professional reputation in Paso Robles that was worth protecting, and nothing in any of that required me to agree to the arrangement that Diana Ashworth had proposed on day 3 with the direct efficiency of a woman who had learned that difficult proposals were best made clearly. I had said no on day 3. Then I had watched Owen and Sebastian spend 2 days running vine rows in the September heat, and I had understood something about the situation that the consulting contract had not prepared me for, and I had said yes on day 5. Now it was day 29, and the harvest was in 3 days, and the 30-day arrangement ended tomorrow, and Sebastian was in his boots at the end of the row asking me if I had to go. I said, "Come on, let's finish checking the block." He fell into step beside me. We moved into the rows. He opened his notebook, the one he had started on day 4, already on its second half. He made a note about the cluster at the vine I had been assessing. After a while, he said, "Owen doesn't want to go either." I did not say anything. He said, "He told me last night. He said he hasn't been this happy since before his mom died." I stopped walking. I was standing between 2 rows of Cabernet Sauvignon vines on a property that 60 years ago Rosamond and Edward Ashworth had planted from bare rootstock, and Sebastian was beside me with his notebook and his boots and the specific devastating honesty of an 8-year-old who does not understand why the truth would be a difficult thing to say, and I did not have an answer for him that was as honest as what he had just said to me. He looked up at me. He said, "Is there an arrangement for the other part?" I said, "What other part?" He said, "The part where you and Mom have coffee on the porch every night and she's different after." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Like she's been reminded of something she forgot." I looked at the vine in front of me. I looked at the fruit. I looked at the hills above the estate in the early October morning. I said, "I'll talk to your mom." He said, "Today?" I said, "Today." He went back to his notebook. I finished the block assessment and called my father. I grew up in Paso Robles, California, in the hills east of the town where my father Hank had managed vineyards since before I was born, and where the specific vocabulary of viticulture was the vocabulary of my childhood. Hank Merritt was a master vintner in the way the word is used in wine country. Not a formal certification, a 40-year earned authority. He had managed 4 vineyards in his career, each one better than the last, and had retired in 2015 after the final one. A 200-acre Cabernet estate north of Paso Robles produced a vintage that a prominent wine publication called the best Central Coast Cabernet of the decade. He was not famous outside the region. Inside the region, his name meant something specific and without qualification. He had taught me the way he taught everything. Hands first, understanding second. You learned what the soil felt like before you learned the chemistry. You learned what a healthy vine looked like before you learned the botany. You learned what the fruit tasted like at various stages of development before you learned the vocabulary for what the taste indicated. The vocabulary was useful. The hands were what the vocabulary described. I left Paso Robles at 22 for UC Davis and a formal degree in viticulture and enology. Davis gave me the technical language for things I already knew and the scientific framework for things I didn't. I went to Napa Valley after Davis and spent 15 years working my way from assistant vineyard manager to the management of a 400-acre estate in the Rutherford appellation. Serious wine, serious work, the kind of operation that demanded the full vocabulary and the hands. I met Margaret in Napa in 2009. We married in 2010. Owen was born in 2011. Margaret was diagnosed in 2018. Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological condition that in her case progressed rapidly to the complications that took 2 years to navigate, and that she navigated with a grace that I thought about many times afterward when I needed to think about grace. She died in February 2020. Owen was 8 years old. I had stayed in Napa for 6 months after, finishing a commitment to the estate that I had made before the diagnosis, honoring it because that was how I functioned. Then I packed and drove south on Highway 101 to Paso Robles, to the house where Hank lived and the hills where I had grown up, and the specific landscape that had been the first thing I understood before I understood almost anything else. Owen grew up between the Napa years and the Paso Robles return with the adaptability that children develop when their circumstances require it. He was curious and meticulous and had begun keeping notebooks at 8 years old after I had told him that a vineyard manager without a notebook was operating from memory, and memory was not reliable enough for decisions that affected living things. He had filled 4 notebooks since he was 8. The current one he had started in July. He was 13 years old, and he had his mother's patience and my tendency to notice things, and he had been happy in Paso Robles with Hank nearby and the hills he recognized, and the specific quality of a place that held things rather than letting them go. He had been happier since September 4th. I had noticed this and had not known what to do with noticing it. Rosamond Ashworth had planted the estate vineyard in 1962 with her husband Edward. Not as an investment, but as the physical expression of an intention to stay somewhere for a long time and make something of it. They had planted Cabernet Sauvignon and Zinfandel and a small block of Grenache on 340 acres of Paso Robles hills and had spent 40 years tending it. Edward died in 2004. Rosamond managed the estate until 2012 when Diana's marriage to a man named Lawrence brought Lawrence into operational management and Rosamond into the background. Lawrence had mismanaged with the specific confidence of a man who did not know what he did not know. Over-irrigating, failing to address disease, neglecting the canopy work that grapevines required with the same reliability that a house requires maintenance, which was that it required it whether or not you were paying attention. Diana divorced Lawrence in 2019. She had been managing the estate herself since then, learning what she could, bringing in help when she could afford it, trying to reverse damage that had been accumulating for years with resources that were not sufficient for the reversal. Rosamond died in late August 2024 at 94. Not suddenly, after a long decline that everyone had known was coming, that Rosamond herself had managed with the specific grace of someone who had made her preparations. Her will had been drafted 15 years earlier and not updated. The relevant condition. The Ashworth Estate transferred to Diana upon death, provided Diana was legally married at the time of transfer. Transfer to occur 30 days after date of death. If the condition was not met, the estate transferred to Rosamond's grandnephew Philip, who had visited twice in 20 years and had a standing offer from a development company for the land. Philip would sell. Everyone who knew Philip understood this. Diana had known about the condition since 2019, when her attorney flagged it during the divorce. She had lived with the knowledge for 5 years, intending to address it, not addressing it, watching Rosamond decline and understanding that the timeline was becoming real. When Rosamond died, she had 30 days. She called me on September 1st, not about the marriage condition, about the vineyard. Her attorney had given her my name. She needed an honest assessment of the damage and whether recovery was possible. I was the person you called in Paso Robles when the problems were serious and you needed someone to tell you the truth. I arrived on September 4th with my assessment kit and Owen with his notebook. I spent the first 2 days on systematic assessment. I walked every row of every block, took soil samples, examined the irrigation system, checked the canopy, identified the Pierce's disease in the Zinfandel block by the yellowing and scorching that was unmistakable to anyone who had seen it. Pierce's disease is caused by a bacterium spread by sharpshooter insects, and there is no cure once it is established in a vine. Management means removal and replanting, a 3 to 5 year process, a loss that is also the only way forward. I documented everything in my notebook and Owen's. Owen has kept parallel documentation since he was 8 years old, and I have long since stopped regarding this as charming and begun regarding it as what it actually is. A second set of careful observations that occasionally catches things I missed. He caught a section of calcium deficiency in the Grenache block on day 2 that I had not yet reached. Sebastian appeared on day 2. He came to the vineyard that morning without asking permission or explaining himself, simply arriving, as if the vineyard had always been where he was going to be on that Tuesday morning, and the question of authorization had not occurred to him. He was wearing boots that were too large for him. I later learned these were his great-grandfather Edward's, kept by Rosamond for 60 years and claimed by Sebastian at 6 years old with the complete authority of a child who has decided something is his. Owen looked at Sebastian. Sebastian looked at Owen. Neither said anything for a moment. Then Owen held out his notebook. Sebastian looked at it. He asked a question. Owen answered. They spent the rest of the morning moving through the vine rows behind me, Sebastian asking questions that Owen answered when he could, and I answered when Owen couldn't. By the end of day 2, Sebastian had decided that the notebook approach was correct and had gone to the house and returned with one of his own. I presented my assessment to Diana on the evening of day 2. The Zinfandel block, 40 acres, had established Pierce's disease throughout. It needed to be removed and replanted. 3 to 5 years. Significant expense. The Cabernet Sauvignon block, 180 acres, had root rot in approximately 60 acres from over-irrigation. Those 60 acres were beyond recovery. The remaining 120 acres were salvageable with aggressive intervention. The harvest from those 120 acres, if properly managed through the next 3 weeks, would be reduced in volume but potentially excellent in quality. Stressed vines concentrate their fruit, and the concentration, if the winemaking was correct, could produce something exceptional from what the mismanagement had left. The Grenache block, 25 acres, was neglected but not damaged, recoverable. Diana listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, "Can it be saved?" I said, "The estate, yes. The Zinfandel block, no. Everything else, yes, but it will take 3 to 5 years of consistent, correct management." She said, "Will you stay and manage it?" I said I was a consultant. I would give her the plan and advise on implementation, but estate management was not what I did. She said, "I'm not asking you to be an estate manager. I'm asking you to stay for 30 days, and there's something else I need to ask you, which you are entirely free to decline." She told me about the will. I said no on day 3, without elaboration, without unkindness. I understood the situation. I was sorry about the condition. I was happy to continue as the vineyard consultant for the full 30 days and provide the best possible recovery plan. But the arrangement she was describing was not something I was the right person for. She said, "I understand. The offer stands if you change your mind." She said it without pressure, without manipulation. The direct quality of someone who had learned that the clearest transactions were also the fairest ones. On day 4, Owen and Sebastian spent the entire day in the vineyard. Owen explained vine training to Sebastian with the patience of a 13-year-old who has recently learned something and wants to demonstrate the learning. Sebastian absorbed it with the focused attention of an 8-year-old who has decided this is important and has his notebook to prove it. They found a hawk's nest at the edge of the Cabernet block and spent 2 hours documenting it in both notebooks with drawings. That evening, I called Hank. I told him about the vineyard, the assessment, the condition, the recovery plan. Hank listened and asked the questions he asked, which were the questions of someone who had spent 40 years thinking about what grapevines needed. Then I told him about the arrangement. Hank was quiet. Then he said, "What did you tell her?" I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's not a real arrangement." He said, "The vineyard is real. The 30 days of work is real. Everything else is a legal formality." A pause. "Is the woman decent?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Is the boy decent?" I thought about Sebastian with his grandfather's boots and his new notebook, asking Owen questions about vine training until Owen ran out of answers. I said, "Yes." He said, "Is Owen all right?" I looked at the window of the guest cottage where Owen was already asleep. I said, "He's happy here." Hank said, "Then I don't understand the problem." I told him I would call tomorrow. He said he knew what that meant. On day 5, I told Diana I had changed my mind. She said, "Thank you." Then, "I want to be clear about what this is and isn't. It's 30 days. You'll have your own space. We'll be honest with the boys about the situation in a way that's appropriate for their ages. At the end of 30 days, we file the paperwork and you go back to your consulting practice and I manage the estate." I said, "All right." She said, "One more thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "Sebastian has already decided you're staying permanently. I want you to know that so you understand what day 30 is going to look like for him." I said I understood. I did not understand until day 29. The courthouse marriage on day 6, September 9th, a Monday, was attended by Cal, Diana, Owen, Sebastian, and Hank, who drove up from town because he said he wanted to see it, and Diana's attorney who needed to be present for legal documentation. 11 minutes. Sebastian wore his boots. Owen wore his good jacket. Hank shook Diana's hand and looked at the estate and said, "Your grandmother planted some of the finest Grenache I've ever seen. I'm glad it's going to get the chance it deserves." Diana said, "We're going to try." Hank looked at me. His expression said something that did not require words. The work of days 6 through 28 was the work the vineyard required. Emergency irrigation correction, reducing water delivery to the affected Cabernet sections, allowing the remaining healthy roots to re-establish without the ongoing stress of oversaturation. Systematic removal of the Pierce's disease-affected Zinfandel vines, the hard specific work of removing 40 acres of established vines that had taken a generation to grow and could not be saved and had to be removed cleanly to prevent the disease spreading to the Grenache block. Canopy management of the surviving Cabernet, positioning leaves and shoots to optimize sun exposure on the developing fruit clusters in the weeks before harvest. Soil pH correction through targeted amendments in the Grenache block. Owen and Sebastian were present for all of it. Owen documented, Sebastian documented. Sebastian asked questions, and when he did not understand the answers, he asked follow-up questions until he did, which was an approach he had apparently settled on as correct and which I had come to consider one of his better qualities. Diana worked alongside me most days. Not as an apprentice, as a landowner learning what her land needed. She was not a vintner and did not pretend to be. She asked the same quality of questions Sebastian asked, which I mentioned to Hank in one of the evening calls, and Hank said it meant she was going to be fine. On the evenings when Diana and I sat on the porch of the main house after the boys were asleep, we talked about the vineyard and what came next, and gradually, the way these things go when two people have spent enough days working on the same problem that the problem becomes a foundation rather than the whole structure, about other things. I did not know what to do with the evenings on the porch. I had not done anything with anything since Margaret. I had come to Paso Robles to consult on a vineyard for 30 days, and I had agreed to a temporary legal arrangement for reasons that had made sense at the time, and that continued to make sense in the way things make sense when they are producing outcomes you did not anticipate. I had not anticipated the evenings on the porch. I had not anticipated the specific quality of Diana's attention when she was listening to something she was genuinely trying to understand. The quality that Margaret had also had, and that I had not expected to find in someone new so quickly, which told me something about Diana that I was not yet ready to name. I had not anticipated Sebastian at the end of the vine row on day 29 in his pajamas and his grandfather's boots. After the block assessment, I called Hank from the edge of the Cabernet block at 7 a.m. I told him about Sebastian. I told him what Sebastian had said about Owen. I told him about the evenings on the porch. Hank listened. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Yes, you do." I said, "It's been 4 years." He said, "I know how long it's been." I said, "The arrangement was 30 days. He said, "The vineyard doesn't know that. The boys don't know that. And from what you're telling me, Diana doesn't know it either." I said nothing. He said, "Your mother and I met because I took a consulting job at her father's orchard in 1979 for 30 days. I left after 14 months. I said, "I didn't know that." He said, "You never asked." I talked to Diana that evening, not on the porch, in the vineyard, at the edge of the Cabernet block where the harvest equipment was staged and the fruit was ready and the 30-day arrangement had 12 hours left. I told her what Sebastian had said. I told her what he had said about Owen. I told her about the call to Hank. I told her what the evenings on the porch had become from my side and asked what they had become from hers. She was quiet for a long time. The vineyard was quiet around us. The specific evening quiet of a working vineyard in harvest season, everything held in the particular suspense of fruit at the edge of its moment. She said, "I told you on day 5 what the arrangement was and wasn't." I said, "I know." She said, "I think I was wrong about one part of it." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part where I said I knew what day 30 was going to look like." 3 weeks after the 30-day arrangement ended, the harvest was complete. The surviving 120 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon had produced 180 tons of fruit, reduced from the estate's historical yield but concentrated in the way that stressed vines concentrate their fruit, the intensity of years of difficulty compressed into something worth keeping. Hank, who had driven up for the first day of harvest, had tasted the fruit and said it was the best Cabernet from this valley in 10 years. The wine was in barrel. The Zinfandel removal was underway. The Grenache was being properly trained for the first time in 6 years. I was still at the estate, not as a contracted consultant, not as a 30-day legal arrangement. As a man who had decided that the 30-day arrangement had been a door that opened in a direction he had not expected, and that he was going to walk through it with his eyes open and see what was on the other side. Sebastian came to the Cabernet block on a Tuesday morning in late October with his boots and his notebook. Owen was beside him with his notebook. They had been doing the morning vineyard walk every day since day 4. There was no particular reason to stop. I was at the head of the block doing the post-harvest assessment, documenting what each vine needed for the dormant season to set up the following year's growth. Sebastian looked at the vines. He looked at me. He said, "You stayed." I said, "I stayed." He said, "Is it because of the vineyard?" I said, "Partly." He said, "Is it because of us?" I looked at him and Owen at the head of the vine row in the late October morning. The light, the particular amber that October gave the hills. The vineyard around them quiet and beginning its winter rest. Both of them with their notebooks and the boots that were still slightly too large. I said, "Mostly?" Sebastian nodded. He opened his notebook and made a note. He and Owen moved into the vine rows and the morning's work continued. Hank arrived at 10. He drove up from town the way he had been driving up 2 or 3 times a week since the harvest. To walk the rows, to look at the vines, to do what old vintners do when a vineyard that has been declining is beginning the long process of coming back. He found me at the edge of the Grenache block and stood beside me and looked at the vines. He said, "How does it look?" I said, "Like it wants to come back." He said, "They always do. You just have to give them what they need and get out of the way." I looked at the Grenache vines, 60 years old, some of them, planted by Edward and Rosamond in 1962 and still alive despite everything that had happened to them in 6 years of mismanagement and the decades of ordinary time before that. I said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Thank you." He said, "For what?" I said, "For teaching me to look at what's actually there instead of what I expect to find." He looked at the vines. He looked at the hills. He looked at the estate house where Diana was visible through the kitchen window, doing whatever Diana did in the mornings before the day's work began. He said, "That applies to more than vineyards." I said, "I know." We stood there for a while in the October morning. The vines were quiet around us. The hills were the same hills they had always been. The estate was in the slow and patient process of becoming what it had been before the years of mismanagement, which was not going to be fast and was not going to be without difficulty and was going to be, in the end, worth the time it took. The things that lasted always were. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment in your life when you said yes to something you hadn't planned to say yes to, and it turned out to be the beginning of something you hadn't known you needed? Not the dramatic version, the ordinary version, a door that opened in a direction you weren't expecting, and you walked through it anyway. Tell me what was on the other side. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.